Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another episode of the Sensory Approach to Manual Therapy. Today, we're going to talk with Hillary Allen, a endurance athlete who is a former client of mine who I used to see when I lived in Colorado, who's gone through some pretty amazing stuff. And I'm going to let her tell her story a little bit, but she's a very smart woman who actually used to have me come and help be a guest lecturer at the Front Range Community College where she used to teach. She's very science-based, and we used to geek out in our sessions all the time over a lot of really nice anatomy and science and biochem stuff. And she's been someone I've been in touch with for a long time now, and really been an inspiration. And welcome, Hillary.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
So I guess the first thing I want to talk to you about today is, one of the most defining moments that has made you kind of quite popular. But I don't know if it's one of the most defining moments of your life, but I know it's a very defining moment that you often speak about, that you've got a TED talk on it, and that you've done a lot of different conversations, even a book about it. And so why don't you tell me a little bit about you and that moment in your life?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I guess a little bit of a background too. So I'm a ultra distance trail runner. I got my start in trail running when I was actually in graduate school. So I have a master's degree in neuroscience and physiology. Um, Basically biochemistry because I'm a chemist from my undergraduate training. But basically I kind of found running is just something. I've always been an athlete my whole life, but it was something that I think was a perfect way that it combined science, a way for me to experience the physical world, and then also, the athletic world and, explore the limits of human potential. And I got
When
into
you and
it,
I yeah, when you and I had met, you had just started running, and you'd come
right.
and you were seeing me for some of your recurring injuries because you had just gotten into it. You
Mm.
hadn't competed yet in your first ultra race.
Mm-mm. No. Yeah, so you were just, yeah, I was thinking about
I mean,
that.
I think I started seeing you in 2012.
Exactly. So that was like right when I had just started grad school. I was just kind of getting into distance running. I had started running on the road, like a road marathon, and I was a tennis player in college, but who ran, but like never exclusively ran and doing something as from an endurance side, the repetitive motion, I was having a few of these little injuries, like overuse injuries, like nothing major, but yeah, you were really helping me in kind of just the treatment and maintenance of just being able to get in kind of the daily grind of running. And this was kind of right on the precipice of when I was discovering trail running, like cue the Disney music of like, Aladdin, like a whole new world. That's literally what I felt.
The endorphins kicked in.
Yeah, and just like this sense of belonging. Like it just felt like it was something that I was made to do. Like and then honestly, 2012, I think that was the first year that I had tried an ultra marathon, like a 50K distance. Um and I really liked it, but I was kind of hesitant with the competition side of things because I'm a very like type A competitive person. Like I didn't want to basically ruin something that I really loved, and I just loved it just for the whole process of it, of
I
just.
I actually remember us talking in my old office in Colorado about, do you race willing to potentially not finish on the podium,
Mhm.
or do you not race at all? But I
Right.
remember in our conversation, those were the options. It wasn't, I'll race and maybe be top 15 or top 20, or maybe I'll just race and I won't even finish in the top 10. It was simply, do I either race and do a podium and I'm willing to accept that, or I don't race? But there was no in between.
Which is like, I don't know, it's kind of crazy because like I think I came from it that standpoint of like if I want to do something, I want to pursue it with excellence and I want to kind of go all in at it. And I think I had kind of um let that mentality ruin my experience in like in college and collegiate tennis, and like it kind of became this idea of like, oh well, what's the point of playing if you're not, if you're not doing well. And I think that kind
If
of
you're not winning, are
ruined
you really
something.
playing?
Right. And I think I didn't want that to kind of enter into the realm of running, and so I chose to not race and to just let it be this thing. and just to let it be this thing that I loved. But then I think the thing about trail and ultra running is like it's easier to do these longer ultra distance races when you're supported by a race, like, and not having to lug my water with me, or like, running 50 miles in the desert, or, a place where a remote, part of the United
Not
States
having
in
to create food
Colorado.
stashes along the way before
Right.
you run.
And it was a cool way of like, oh, well, I don't have to map this out. I want to run in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, and I've never been there, and they're putting on this race, so why not? So that is kind of what allowed me to kind of like to cross over into trying trail racing. And I I kind of had to accept the fact that I was like, okay, Hill, like, you have to be okay with the fact that it might not go perfectly. Like, be okay with it no matter what, and just do it because you love it. And that was something, actually, after we started working together, I really had to work on that mindset. And
And I think that mindset is one that helped you when you came back,
oh yeah. And so
because the working through it became so valuable.
yeah, and so I think before, I think I would have described myself, even at the beginning of when I got into trail and ultra distance running, I was more of a performance and results driven athlete. And now I would describe myself as a process driven athlete. And I mean, kind of fast forward, just basically, so I got into running. I ended up doing really well, ended up with a sponsorship from the North Face. Now I actually run for Brooks Running. But I'm still, a sponsored athlete. But basically, I was competing in this style of racing called sky running. And it's basically what?
Sorry, just before we get to the Sky
Yeah,
Marathon, I know the
yeah,
story you're about to tell, because I mean I
yeah,
was there for part of this.
yeah,
But when you said you now feel that you're a process driven athlete
yeah.
as opposed to a performance driven athlete, um, I've worked with so many athletes throughout my career, and here where I am now in Sherbrooke, Canada, I've got one who wants to go to Paris Olympics in weightlifting, one who just qualified for world championships in weightlifting, but it's their first competition ever. Like, they went
Mm,
to a competition just as a joke, and they happened to do so well that they qualified for world championships, and like, so many athletes find themselves that way. And so they're in this place mentally where they're so confused about where to go with their career. And I talked to them after having been with so many high end athletes about the um, process driven athlete, about how that is really where you feel fulfillment. Because if
hmm
it's performance driven, then you go up and down. You have these massive waves of joy and euphoria and depression and burnout. Do you feel that being a process driven athlete was only possible for you once you had succeeded as a performance athlete? Because you had success as a performance athlete,
mm.
and had you not had that success as a performance athlete, do you think the process would have ever showed up, or would you still be seeking that performance?
This is a great question, and it's something I've reflected on quite a bit. So as I kind of alluded to before, and I think I didn't maybe recognize it until a little bit later, um, is the fact that before I got into competition at all, I wanted to be driven by the process itself. So I actually didn't let myself enter a competition until I loved what I was doing, until I just was okay with, like, if once I signed that registration slip and I paid the money to enter this race, I was okay with the result either way. I was okay with winning. I was okay with getting last. I was okay with anything in between, because I wanted to kind of tame that beast inside of my head before because I didn't, like I said, I didn't want it to ruin, because I loved running, and I loved trail running so much, from the exploration to how much I felt like it made me a better person. I'm very goal oriented, and it was a very positive thing that helped me to, like, prioritize my day. And I let myself, I really wanted to prioritize that instead of being results driven only. Then, let myself just love it, because this is what happened. But, but then again, the chicken or the egg. Previously, I had this experience in tennis where I was a process driven athlete. I happened to just to love the sport, and then I happened to be fairly good at it. I then got a scholarship, played in tennis in college, and then I think it was the overemphasis on performance that kind of led to this burnout, where I was like, I actually don't love this anymore, because but I think, again, I got out of it because at my core, I'm a process driven person. The
Yeah, I've
reason why
worked.
I lost
Yeah,
the
I,
love of
I,
tennis was because, like, everyone else was emphasizing the performance, and that's the reason why you play, but that's not why I played. And
I've worked
so
with the WTA quite often,
yeah.
and it's one of the things I love about the WTA is that they have at all their major tournaments, they have a sports psychologist as well as therapists. And
Oh
now
yeah.
all the athletes get to see, it's part of, like, every night we do a meeting with all the medical staff where we talk about athletes and what we've noticed that day, and the psychologist is part of those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such an amazing thing because they see that was such a thing that burnt out so many athletes. And they don't have that as much in the ATP, but in the WTA, it's one of the more unique things I've loved about working with them is that they really
Yeah.
highlight that mental health of, okay, is it purely about performance? Is it about being the best you can? Is it about enjoying the moment? It's really shifted a lot of the mentality a lot.
Totally. And like tennis is such a sport as well. And also, I mean, also endurance running, like you spend a lot of time in your head. There's this whole like literally there can be a palpable shift in a match when like the momentum changes, and it can all be about mindset and how a player like attacks a different strategy. That was something that I loved about tennis. And I could tell that like outside energy was kind of like that would influence it. And, this is honestly what ultimately led me to my path and, my graduate work in, pursuing a degree in neuroscience. And I think that's also helped me now in my current, what I'm doing currently in sport. But I think I've always been a process driven person, but I am very goal oriented. And there is no getting away from the fact that professional sports, in every single capacity, it is a performance based sport. So, but I think the magic happens when you can separate the two. Separate, I think, your worth as a person and the performance side. And I think one of the like this big kind of defining moments for me in my life was really being able to tap into that after this big injury that I had. And then honestly, I mean, really believing in the process and relying upon that for motivation as opposed to strictly performances.
So let's talk about that for a minute because the goal behind this podcast is to talk a little bit about trauma. Now, a
Mhm.
lot of a lot of humans have experienced trauma. I don't want to diminish what others have experienced.
Mhm.
A lot of athletes have experienced trauma. Now, your story around trauma, for those who don't know, I'm going to let Hillary talk to us about her one step that she's had before, and it's a unique story around trauma, and the coming back from it is also really quite unique. And I was fortunate enough as a therapist to be involved in knowing you before the accident and then also helping you through your recovery.
Mhm.
But the moment about the trauma is really where we're going to spend some time today, about what it took to get back. So all those
Mhm.
photos of you in the hospital bed and stuff like that. Those are really where we're going to focus because that's really
Yeah.
where I want to highlight. Because, like you said, you're a fan of neuroscience.
Mhm.
Um, since I ended up leaving Boulder, I've spent every moment I can studying neuroscience and designing classes around what touch does to the brain and how it affects pain and all these different components that affect the brain through neuroscience. And I've got podcasts lined up with about 4 neuroscientists at the moment for the coming year. And so it's just one of those things that, to me, the trauma aspect is so valuable. So why don't you tell me about your one step?
Yeah. And so, all that background that I kind of gave about just like my history in running, I started competing professionally in this circuit called the Sky Running Circuit. So it's basically these very technical races. I've discovered I have a very strong knack of uphill running. So my nickname is the Hilly Goat. So I chose these races, which basically were the kind of the steepest types of trail running. So it's basically a 50-kilometer race, and it would climb anywhere, so about 31 miles. It would climb anywhere between 3 to 4,000 meters. So that's between like 12 and 14,000 feet of elevation gain in this race. And they go like all over the world. And so I was competing in these circuits for several years. And this was about my one defining moment. This is about, 3 years into my professional
And
running
you were very
career.
successful. I mean, you were number one in the world at this time, and you had been
Yeah,
winning races quite
all over the
consistently.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I took my first sponsorship year as just I was like, okay, like I'm gonna try this. I'm just coming out of grad school. Let's see, like, Yeah, I knew that, like, a career as a professional athlete is not one that's straightforward or guaranteed. So I was gonna take it a year at a time, and it was going well. Like, I won the US Skyrunning Series in 2014, 2015. I was already ranked fifth in the world. I was climbing the ranks, and then by 2017, I was actually winning. I was ranked number one in the world, and I was kind of at one of these races, these sky races in Tromsø, Norway, and it was kind of like a victory lap race. Like, I was had enough points in the series that I was going to win, and so I wasn't doing anything crazy, but it was just this race which had the type of terrain that I love to run on. It's like class 3, class 4. So very rough terrain. You're kind of running up on this ridge line. And I remember being on this ridge line, and one moment I was, running, and the next I was literally in the air. And trail running, with the job description, you fall a lot, right? Like, I'm no stranger to like that feeling of like, oh, I caught a toe, or like, I'm gonna, you brace yourself for like, oh, I like, you recognize that you're falling. It happens so quickly, but you can kind of recognize it. This was different than anything I've ever experienced, because it was just like the rug got pulled out from underneath me. And I immediately recognized that the horizon was upside down, that it wasn't where it was supposed to be, and that I was falling. And it's crazy how
My
quickly.
heart rate is going faster, by the way.
Right. And it's crazy how fast that happens. It's like the neuroscience and the neurochemistry, how quickly adrenaline rushes in. Like, literally time slowed down, and I almost experienced myself floating above my head watching the situation happen, telling myself in my own voice that, like, in a very direct manner, like, okay, Hillary, you're falling. Brace yourself for impact. Like, this is it, like, it's all going to be over soon, but basically talking myself through this as I kind of hit the ground and was airborne, and that was all on repeat until somewhere along the way I either passed out, or stopped falling. Um, yeah,
You
and that
you
was,
fell close to 150 feet, correct?
yeah, like 150 feet, about like 50 meters, and not
Down a
absolutely
down a big scree field.
exactly. So basically I hit the ground, then was in the air again, hit the ground, and like kind of like tumbled, fell down this mountainside.
Were I can't remember if you were conscious or unconscious when you were at the bottom.
So I was definitely conscious for the first couple of tumbles, because I remember it quite vividly, and it's still a dream that I have. And then, I mean, I think that falling dream is actually kind of quite common, but mine is from an actual memory. So
Memory based.
my brain doesn't have to conjure it up; it's there. And then yeah, so basically, like I said, I think I was unconscious. I was definitely unconscious when I hit the ground. I don't remember stopping. I just remember waking up with this guy's face like really close to mine.
So I mean, that's a unique injury in and of itself, and let alone a
Mhm.
trauma. I mean, you walked away with uh, two broken legs, or no, two broken arms, a broken
Yeah.
leg. How many ribs?
5 ribs. I broke both of my feet. I didn't break my legs, but I broke both of my feet, like twisted my ankles like very severely. I think, I don't know, maybe there were some fractures in there, but I broke my back. So in total, I think it was like 14 bones that I had broken.
And you spent, was it 3 weeks in Norway or 3 months in the hospital, and then you flew back to the US and had more operations done there?
Yeah, so basically they wanted to keep me longer in Norway, but I was there for almost 3 weeks, a good 2 weeks before I flew back home, and then had more operations and surgeries here in the United States.
So I want to talk about that for a moment, and then we'll get into, okay, going back to being an athlete again, because that's where, we dealt with the recovery process between me, and then I believe you were at Performance,
Revo Sports and Performance.
Revo Sports and Performance in
Hmm.
Colorado. We were all working together on you at the time. Um, but when you first have the accident, okay, it's trauma. You had the outer body experience, which people talk about all the time. You spoke to yourself. People talk about that as well. You remember
Hmm.
flashes of it. Um, right before you started telling about it, your voice trembled. And this is how many years later? We're talking about 7 or 8 years later, and your
Hmm.
voice still has that catch in it.
Mhm.
And so my question is those 2 weeks in the hospital, you're in Norway, uh, you don't speak the language. I know I lived in Norway, so I know a lot of them speak English, but not everybody speaks English. It's foreign language. You're in a foreign hospital, no family around. They have to come visit, all that kind of stuff. Mentally, in that first 2 week period that you were in the hospital, yes, you're drugged out, you're on medication for the pain, but you also have conscious periods of time, some more lucid than others. Are you able to, and have you ever done the work to try to do an inner body experience around that 2 week period where post injury you're like, okay, this is what I just went through?
Hmm.
Or where is it still, no, I need to disconnect from this experience? As a lot of traumas do, they create this massive disconnect. And the reason I ask that is because with so many traumatic experiences, we get, reactive behavior as opposed to proactive behavior. We have something enter our field of vision, our field of influence, our stimulus, and we react to that stimulus unknowingly. We don't know why we shake, yell, get excited, get jumpy, whatever. We don't know why we have these reactions. And they're often PTSD responses or traumatic responses. Um, and they've done some studies where they see that the more the individual within a controlled environment with people they trust, like psychologists or family or friends or loved ones, the more they can relive those moments, the less likely they are to have reactive experiences
Mm.
around traumatic triggers, and the more likely they are to be proactive in role playing a trigger, to so that if they are out in the real world and a car stops in front of them suddenly, they don't have a traumatic response. So have you done, like, first of all, during that 2 week period, how often did your brain go back to the memory? But even since then,
Mhm.
how often have you found yourself being pulled back to it, but not in an unconscious way, not like, oh, I'm going for running. Oh, yeah, I remember when I fell. More like a real conscious thought of that's what it was like to be in the moment.
Yeah, so you're bringing up a lot of really interesting concepts. I think overall what you're talking about is like neuroplasticity. This whole idea of kind of reshaping and reforming your
My listeners are very common with it. I've done an entire podcast on
right.
synaptic plasticity and long term potentiation and things like that.
Exactly. You're trying to like reform this. This is actually a lot of stuff behind psychology and trying to like help someone through like a traumatic situation or even habit forming, right? Like it can be really simple. It doesn't have to just be applicable to that. Um, but I do think it's actually really important because I think the less that you talk about it, or like you're saying, recreate that experience and form a different, almost like reaction to it.
Narrative around it. Yeah.
Yeah, narrative around it is like this is why the importance of talk therapy, I think. It helps because you can move past it. It's something humans are the most resilient animals out there, so it's actually normal for us to be resilient and work through trauma instead of just being hung up on it, right? But I think if you avoid it, that's when the bad things can happen. But specifically to answer your question about my experience, you know, I was just in survival mode. So I think I couldn't really dwell on it. Like there was a time when I was kind of like in the immediacy after the accident, about, probably 3 days until my mother was actually able to come to be in the hospital with me in Norway, that I was, not even really aware that the accident had happened to me. You know,
Yeah. You were still too lucid in outer body still.
right. And I was just obviously in so much pain on so much morphine. And, like I still wasn't quite aware, but it then kind of brought me back to earth when my mother was there. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, actually, whoa, I see the metal in my body. Like, this is actually, I'm the one who fell. But I think still, I was in survival mode for, probably 6 months after the initial fall. And then of course I was having this dream. My brain was reliving the experience. But I really wasn't, I was too busy surviving and trying to figure out, like I'm a problem solver. I'm like too busy setting goals and like figuring out all of this stuff that honestly I wasn't I wasn't purposely going back there and reliving it until honestly, to be honest, I don't think it was until 18 months later. And
I remember when you and I were started seeing, I remember I didn't have an elevator in my building, so I had to help you down the stairs with your little scooter when you had
yes.
your one leg on the scooter. And I remember the first time I touched your leg with the scars that looked like the bear claws.
Hmm.
Um, I remember, I do remember you had a moment on the table where obviously it was very, it was the first time somebody had done
Hmm.
non-surgical care
Hmm.
around one of your injuries. And I remember you started shaking and having this moment of, obviously a traumatic response to touch
Hmm. Hmm.
around an injury that was in a therapeutic but non-aggressive manner. And I remember for the sessions that we saw each other up until I ended up leaving Colorado, actually up until you ran, and I think it was Montana, the
Yeah.
first race you, up until then, and then even after that, because you talked about, your foot was still the longest lasting injury after that. We
Yeah.
that ended up getting resolved after I had left Colorado. But I
Hmm.
remember every time we treated it, your brain used to hone right back into it. The disassociative state would disappear and you'd come right back. And the reason I talk about that is because, I'm a massage therapist. So for me, touch, and
Hmm.
psychology and massage therapy, are they separate? Yes and no, right?
I
Like,
agree. Yeah.
yes, like
We would touch
it,
on both like every time I was in there because it was such like it was such a I do remember that quite distinctly because I was so afraid to have someone I felt like so fragile, I was so afraid to have someone touch me. And I just was like holding on to all this other tension in other areas of my body that weren't necessarily injured. But like yeah, so that was important to me, but like I mean, I don't think I actually let myself really go back into that moment until I injured myself again. Like I broke my ankle slipping on the ice, like, 18
yeah.
months later, after I had made this whole comeback, after I had returned to running, we had worked through all of these, I was working through kind of there's honestly like reverberating pain and like this like kind of
I
phantom
remember
pain.
I saw you twice before I moved away from Colorado after that. And that was
Yeah.
it. And then I had to, and then we weren't able to see. And I remember, yeah,
Yeah.
that fear you had of this is going to be my future. I'm always going to have a new
Mhm.
pain. Like this mentality had set in. And this
Mhm.
is kind of what I was getting at earlier about that trauma response, where because you had pain now, completely unrelated to your previous injury. This is a
Mhm.
brand new catalyst. Like you could have been completely healthy, had never fallen in Norway,
Mhm.
and slipped on the ice and broken your foot. Completely
Mhm.
unrelated injury.
Yeah.
And yet the response was, I've been injured again. And the response was so magnified as a
Mhm.
reactive state,
Mhm.
as though you had gone through trauma again, when in reality you'd slipped on the ice. And yes, you'd broken your foot, and that's unfortunate. But like in August, I kicked my door by accident. I stubbed my toe and I broke my foot.
Oh
Like
my God. Oh,
I had to
no,
cancel working for the WTA this summer because I broke my foot this summer and I had to
yeah,
walk around in a boot. And it's like, that's not a trauma. I didn't associate it to a trauma. I associated to
right.
this idiocy, like a a lapse in judgment doing laundry. And so your reactive state had become one where every injury, and I remember it was the same when we treated, every time we talked about your injury, it was, I don't know if brainwashing is the right word, but it was almost like always having to reconvince your brain
Yep.
that discomfort is normal in the body
Mhm.
when you're recovering and when you're an endurance athlete. And that discomfort is not, I'm in trauma again.
Right. And that was really interesting to me because even before I had, before my accident, when I was seeing you, it wasn't that, like that kind of negative association, or it wasn't quite the like going off the deep end, like kind of spiraling, right? So I actually, so when I did re-break, when I when well, not re-break, but when I broke my ankle on the ice and I was basically forced into this thing, I saw myself kind of going down this very negative, black and white thinking, like, oh my God, this is my future, this is what I'm going to be forever. And I really honestly, that was kind of the time when I started writing my book about the injury recovery, and I immersed myself in like what I actually went through in that first recovery from my accident and working through that. Like this was also when I started, like I did a TED talk, but I made this conscious decision to start talking about what had happened to me because I saw in real time how it was changing the narrative and saying like, oh, okay, like I was in this situation. This really reminds me of an emotional state that I'm in right now. But I got through that and I was trying to kind of look at the different things that I was doing or the different behaviors or, patterns that I was kind of going through and really like cultivate that mindset and figuring out, okay, like changing that narrative. For me, it was also like a positive mindset of, okay, like you've done this before, you can do this again. And but really re-immersing myself in it and talking about it more when I really hadn't done that for a year and a half because I was so focused on just getting back to baseline. And the other thing that I was doing, but I don't think I realized how much of a positive impact that it had during my accident, like the 2 weeks, in Norway, even though I had two broken arms, I could actually like still type and kind of like hold on to a pen in a really weird way. But I was actually journaling and writing because like I had so many emotions and I was really afraid to say them to people because although,
It can take you to a dark place, trauma.
yeah, and
It can
like
take you to the darkest place.
I literally like it was so tough for me. Like I didn't see the point of like trying to keep going if, like cuz I didn't feel like myself, and I don't want to say that to my mother who's like, right there that I had like wished the accident would have killed me, but I was literally feeling that. And then at the same time, so grateful that I survived and that I wasn't paralyzed. Like it obviously could have been worse, but I was still experiencing these really dark emotions and I needed a safe place to basically to let that out and journaling and writing fulfilled like created that space for me.
Did
Um
did you ever find did you ever find an outlet beyond that? So like with someone who you could speak with where you were allowed to
yeah.
have that potential loss of grief? I mean, what you're describing to me reminds me of grief. Like the grief of
Oh
who
yeah.
I was is dead. And
Hmm.
I'm still alive, but I'm no longer that individual. And for a lot of people, there's a grief in that moment. And if you don't have the ability to describe that grief, a lot of people would say exactly like you had just said, "Oh, you're lucky to be alive. You're lucky you're not paralyzed. Somebody else got hit by a car, and look at their
Yeah.
state." They're,
And I'm like,
and you
this
could
doesn't
do a
help me.
comparative analysis, but it doesn't help your grief.
Yeah. And
Exactly.
that was the beauty of it too, is because just finding and discovering those people around me that I could say those things to, and they didn't try to change it. They just sat with me in it and just like, and it didn't have to be, of course, now, and I did find a very good sports psychologist and a regular, counselor psychologist, but, it doesn't have to always be that. But of course, that's a safe space. But that was actually a really beautiful part of it. It wasn't everyone, and, that's okay. But it was those people that I could actually have, an honest conversation with, and they didn't try to immediately compare it away.
I
Um,
remember I remember when you started talking about training again, because originally it was, am I going to walk?
yeah.
Am I going to walk pain free? Now,
Hmm.
okay, well, now I can walk pain free. Am I going to run? Am I going to run pain free? It was, one step at a time. That's a bad joke, by the way. And I just remember when you were getting ready to go to Montana, where you'd been training and you didn't know what your fitness was like and all these things like that. But I remember it was one of those things that we talked about so often in the clinic was giving you the space to essentially be afraid that
Yeah.
whatever you were as an athlete may not be who you are as an athlete anymore, but that, hey, go and do it and see where you are. And so
Well,
what
that's the process driven thing. That's actively practicing the process driven thing. And I think that's so incredibly hard at coming from someone who's, you mean, me. I'm a very like sometimes I can be too black and white and cut and
well,
dry and
I, I
like,
I remember we used to talk a lot about the science of the human body. I still have it on my poster in the clinic where you signed it. It was just, we talked about science
yeah.
so much, and it was very much if it isn't or if it is. It was like, what
Mhm.
does the science say? So I want to talk about what it took mentally for you to go, or what is it that made you want to run again? Let's go beyond the fact that it's where you had an identity prior to the fall
Mhm.
and the fact that it felt good. Now you're thinking of going back to it and you have the memory of, this is who I used to be and this is how I used to feel. But now wrapped up in that memory is this moment of this fear of, will I, can I? And
Mhm.
also, am I still going to find joy in this experience?
Yeah.
Um, and so mentally getting to the start line of that first event and then it not being a marathon and not being a road race, it's still being a trail race. What
Mhm.
is it that made you, what is it that helped you get to that point? Was it community talking? Was it self driven? Was it self reflection? Because that's the goal here, is to help other humans who have
Mhm.
experienced trauma to sit there and say, what can I do? Like, sure, massage is good. Touch therapy. I mean, as we talked about when we touched your leg for the first time, It
Hmm.
really helps people understand that they've been bottling up a lot of stress around it. But
Hmm.
there's so much more to it than that. There's so much that goes inside and internalized. And I've got a series of podcasts on burnout and depression. And the main thing we talk about there is no, the only way out of that loop is communication. You have to talk to humans. You have to admit, I'm in depression, I'm in burnout, so you can come out of it. So, what is it that helped you get to that start line, really?
Yeah, and actually I'm just smiling because I remember that we were actually we were trying to do a podcast about like the depression and burnout. And this is, I mean, and I was experiencing that in a big way. And I'm 6.5 years after this accident, and even this past year I kind of had a re-injury of this stuff. And I was dealing with like the depression and burnout in a really big way. And so actually it was like, hey, can we I'm talking to like I'm talking about it like to my psychologist and all this other stuff. Like I'm working through it, but right now I don't need to put it like out there until I'm in a better spot. So yeah, I definitely appreciate all that. But yeah, I mean, that was what the biggest thing that got me um out of a rut. For sure, I'm definitely self-driven and self-motivated. Um, but it's scary to put yourself out there, and especially in a race and coming from being an elite athlete, and then it's performance, you're judged by your performance in many ways. And I was definitely scared that I'd be, what happens if I wasn't elite anymore? Like that's a really scary thing of like,
Identity
putting yourself.
crisis.
Yeah, it is an identity crisis. And so again, what I did to myself is I really worked on that mindset of like really being okay with not winning and not even finishing in the elite field if I decided to do that race again. And what really helped me to, obviously I was working on that with my team of, my coach, my sports psychologist, my PTs. And so again, it was really being in touch with that process driven of like being so proud of the work that I put in, and knowing that I am and was a different person than I was before the accident. And that it meant why I did it, because it meant so much to me to be able to pin on a bib again. But really the people that it was the community and the people that got me to that start line. The people who were closest to me in my life, and that was my coach, my PT, and a few people who were just like, encouraging me to really do it, not because they're like, oh yeah, we need to prove the Hilly's back, and like, oh, I coached her back to greatness again. Like, no, it had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the fact that they knew that I could do it, and they recognized that it was really important for me to run again, no matter the result after such a traumatic event.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
But
So
that
then,
didn't change the fact how terrifying it was. Literally, it was so scary to put on that bib. And like, I remember waking up race morning. I was like, do I really want to do this? Like, I can still not go, And
so
so,
when during that first race, how often would you say your mind did it, and if so, how often did your mind flash back to Norway?
it actually, I do remember the first time that I ran after the accident, and it was like running, like it was like, a minute run, and then like, I would walk
30
for
second walk, a minute run,
exactly.
30-second walk. I
Like,
remember those. Yeah.
and I remember the first running steps in my brain, it was on repeat, like don't fall, don't fall, don't fall. And like I was on a flat path, like there was nothing that I could trip or fall on. But like, so it's crazy how much like my brain remembered like what was happening to me.
Fear avoidance, pain catastrophizing around. Now it's got,
Totally.
you've got predictive text and associative memory to running as a painful or trauma
Hmm.
inducing experience as opposed to falling as a trauma inducing experience. It's
Right, right.
all wrapped up into one big image.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I do remember like in that ultra that I was doing, like of course your brain, kind of like, and it's like, and then it goes a lot of different places. And I do remember,
Yeah, you're
uh,
running for a very long time. Your brain
right, that
has the time to do a lot of things. I
exactly. And so
mean,
the
it's
good
what,
thing,
17, 18 hours on average? Is that it?
wait, what? No, for a 50K, no. For
No,
50K, it's
no,
like,
no, no, no. The ones that you were doing,
oh,
the Shawnee
yeah,
one, the Indonesia one,
yeah. So I mean, those,
that's
yeah,
real ultra running, right? Those are even
yeah, like
further.
for a day at a time.
Yeah. You're running almost an entire 24 hours at one point.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Your
at
brain has
least
time
for
to
a
go
full day.
places.
Yeah, exactly. Like for full daylight or whatever. But like this one was, probably 5, 6 hours. And it came out in just and this happens actually. I can't remember if it happened like this before the accident, but it happens like this quite frequently now after the accident, is I'll just start crying. And it's very cathartic. Like I remember the moment that I started crying at this race was on the first big climb, and this was only, like hour and a half into the race, and I saw the
Now, this
photographer.
is 6 months after discharge, right?
10 months.
10 months. Okay.
But I was running about 6 months, starting to first run at 6 months after. And I saw the photographer. I knew she was going to be there, but she was at that race in Norway, and she was at this race that I was doing. And I just started crying. And it wasn't because I was in pain. It wasn't because I was scared. I just started crying. And it was because it was, I think, a bunch of emotions at once, of being proud, of being like scared, and still unsure, and that I was doing this race, like what if the fear of like my finishing place or time, or my like the outward perception of like what I was doing. And it was just, and then like gratitude for her being there that day. Like everything kind of came out just in the form of tears.
You describe a
um
really interesting concept that I talk about in a lot of my classes called allostatic load, which is our ability to withstand stressors, positive or negative, doesn't matter, prior to feeling overwhelmed. And
mm,
like those tears just like randomly coming out. Um, in psychology, you guys call it the window of tolerance. In physics,
mm,
it's called allostatic load. And it's
mhm,
essentially, like, window of tolerance incorporates gravity, it incorporates wanting to go to the bathroom, it incorporates foods, working out, family, stress, jobs, all that kind of stuff. But when you describe the sensation of just running and having these tears and it's still happening, all it makes me think of is like your window of tolerance psychologically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally is reaching this like level of just, for good and negative emotions, positive and negative, just like of
mhm.
overwhelmed. And the response is, to an overwhelmed state, we have, as humans, we have to find a release. And the most common
Yeah.
release is painful responses because it changes behavior. But if it's a
Mhm.
non-painful experience, sometimes those responses are just like you said, like some version of release. And
Mhm.
you see it with people with manic laughter. You see it with spontaneous bursts of tears, like you're describing. It
Mhm.
just makes me think that's an interesting correlation between, feeling these sensations of gratitude and fear and confidence and pride and stress and nervous energy all wrapped up in this. And then boom, you see this lady who was there, and it's
Mhm.
everything comes overwhelming.
Yeah. And so it's like, so, I'd let myself kind of go there and like, think about it. And then I'd always try, I had these strategies of, because I was working with my sports psychologist about that exact thing of, if I was feeling too inside my head of like, okay, I'm really thinking about this accident, like what is something that can bring me out of that? And so it's like focusing on certain senses, or like, something that I could smell or see or feel to kind of bring me back. Um and yeah, so I mean it was something, I don't remember how many times like, I was kind of pulled away, but it was a nice practice in like mindfulness. And do you think that when you're running that you're like super mindful in the moment, but in ultra distance races, maybe not, because you're spending so much time,
Who
so
can
much
be
time out
mindful
there.
for that long, right? That's a ridiculous long
Yeah,
period of
it's
time
a
to be
it's a good
mindful.
challenge. It's a good practice. It's partly, I think, why I love it, because you have to be in the here and now, for you're like forced to be there for long periods of time.
So you're getting back into running. You end up doing very well in that first race. You end up winning it, correct?
Well, so this actually
I thought
this
you won
this
that.
So no, so this race was so this is kind of funny, because I think this is the thing that like ripped off the Band-Aid. This is a series of two races. I did a vertical kilometer, which I got second in, which was very good. And then the other race I did, which is the 50K, was I got sixth. So like not bad, but not like I didn't win it. But like I think that allowed me to be like, okay, I can do this. So then literally the next weekend, I already had a plan to go out to Cortina in Italy with my North Face team to like do kind of a talk, because there was a race there that they were doing. It was the Lavaredo race. North Face used to be a sponsor of it. And I literally contacted the race director and was like, hey, I want to sign up for the 50K. And I won that race. And I think I was only maybe 5 minutes from the course record, which I had held. And so that was really cool. And it's like, it's that thing. It's like, okay, well, I already did it. I did the race and I was kind of like, okay, like, I was no longer afraid of a bad result. And, sixth place isn't a bad result, but it's like, not the same as if you're winning those races, before. And so I was just kind of like no longer afraid and truly no longer afraid of, what it would feel like, what it would be like. And, that fear of, letting myself or other people down. And so I was just almost like had this kind of like liberating feeling. And yeah, then that was super cool to be able to like, cross the finishing tape and be like, oh my goodness, this is what happens when I felt like I, continued to bet on myself. And yeah.
Yeah, it's you're describing a word that keeps coming to my mind is acceptance. Like in the podcasts I did on burnout and depression, one of the ways out of it is accepting our weaknesses and accepting our strengths. Accepting that we're human. We have pros and cons in every human on the planet. And trauma is one of those things that we see with a lot of the research around trauma is that accepting that you've gone through a traumatic experience and that it does change you and it does have an effect on who you are long term, potentially permanently. And accepting those changes is one of the first steps in the process of going beyond them. And I know that's something that you'd worked a lot on when I was still seeing you, but it sounds like that's one of those things that's really taken you quite a long way. So throughout this whole experience, at what point, because then after Italy, I remember you were doing a few more races, not an incredible amount, but you were doing a few more. And then at what point did you decide you wanted to turn your story into a book for other people to understand? Because to me, that seems like a very cathartic experience to talk about your own self and your own injury. And like you have to go in, you have to remember, you have to put it into a written format, which can be very encouraging and can be very, it can be a great self therapy. But was that why? Was the intent self therapy? Was it just people were asking you about the story and you were tired of telling it?
Yeah. And that was like kind of back to one of your first questions. Like I do think actually retelling my story is what helped me normalize it and have it not be so scary. And it was something that was so important that allowed me to get back to running and to get back to sport in general and also to put on a race bib again. It was the fact that I was, more comfortable telling my story and that it was just, part of being resilient and kind of working through that trauma.
Do you feel like having to tell that story over and over again also put you in a box, gave you an identity that, for better or for worse, that you either enjoyed or didn't enjoy it, but that was put on you from the outside as opposed to one that you took on from the inside?
Yeah. Definitely because like it's, 6.5 years and I did get a lot of like attention from it. It's
You're
like
still getting this podcast about it right now.
but every athlete, it's like has a story, right? And I think so yeah, it can be like a negative thing. It's like the stories that you tell yourself, but like, I don't want to be sure it can be a way of people like just following along and, my recovery story and kind of what I've accomplished since which, sometimes I forget how amazing it is, but um it's not for me what I try to get out of that box of like, being recognized as someone who fell off a cliff, like I joke about it. But really what I want
That's a great joke. Who are
what I
you? Oh,
want
I'm the one who fell off the
no,
cliff here.
literally. Yeah, exactly. Like it's like, yeah. I'm the one that fell. Yeah, cool. But like let's get that out of the way. But like what I want to be recognized and remembered for is not falling off a cliff. It's everything that I've done after that fact, everything that
That's
I
awesome.
stand for after that. It's like, yes, I'm the one that fell off a cliff, but you're going to remember me because I'm still here in this sport doing things that I never thought were actually possible, that I never thought I would be able to do again. I'm running races that are further than I ran before I
Didn't you
actually
just do
fell.
one in Indonesia that was quite far?
In Thailand, yeah, I did a
Yeah.
100K race through the jungle. And like, I've done 100-mile races and that was a distance that I never run before this fall. And before this fall, like the accident. But like
Yes.
It's this whole idea of I want to be that reminder of human resilience and what it means like to pick yourself up after a hard moment, to not let it break you. And that in a nutshell is why I wrote this book. And the reason, and yes, writing was very cathartic for me. It was an incredible experience that I actually ironically started writing this book when I was in a period of injury. And it really helped me to work through that from an emotional and mental standpoint. But more so than anything, throughout all of these injuries, I never had an example of someone who had a traumatic fall like mine and worked their way back. So I was very much on my own. I did the recovery on my own with the help of, you and my amazing, team of PTs. However, this story of the athlete and like I obviously have an interest in neuroscience, like that mental side of things was so untouched. You always see the
Yeah.
story of, it's like the hero's journey of like they're down and out, and then the next time you hear from them, they're winning races again. Well,
It's Rocky running up the steps.
yeah, and that's not realistic. That's not how my story was. I mean, we had endless conversations of like, is this normal? Like, how come I felt fine yesterday and today I feel like crap? Like, how come I wasn't hurting yesterday, but today my foot's in pain? And I was so confused by it because it wasn't logical. But the more I went through many injury recoveries, the more normal that actually it became and that it is. And so I wanted to put words to it, and more so than anything, I wanted to remind people that they're resilient and that these really tough moments, whether that's an injury or, a life-changing moment like moving or career change or starting a family, like those are not moments that like there might be defining moments, but they don't have to, break you.
And they don't
And
have to be the last moment. They don't have to be
exactly.
the last defining moment. They're just
Yeah,
a defining moment. The next one's around the corner.
exactly. And that like change, I really thought that like change is really, it's very scary, but it's literally the only constant in life. And it's
I mean,
actually,
now you're a cyclist, so there's great
yeah,
change there. You just did the Dirty Kansas last year.
yeah.
We were
I've
just talking
done
about
like
cycling before the podcast.
yeah, like I've become a multi-sport athlete, which is something that's really cool. I was able to just to go into different, areas like, like I wrote a book. I think that's a really cool thing. Figuring out that writing is a really cool medium of expression for myself. I've become a coach, so I get to help people also through injuries and, training for races and all of this stuff. So, um, yeah, it's a really cool way to be able to rediscover different interests and like I think also just become a more complete and full human and not just like focus on just one side of things all the time. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that. And I love the not letting the fall be the defining moment, that it's just a moment and
Mm-hmm.
that from it, you've come through it into someone who your memory you want it to be someone who was resilient, not someone
Mm-hmm.
who fell, but someone who was an athlete even though they fell. And I love
Yeah.
that because it's so much more descriptive of most humans.
Mm.
Athletes, I often hear stories. A lot of my weekend warriors are, oh, I'm not a professional athlete. I couldn't do that. I'm like, absolutely, you are. You're not a
Yeah.
professional athlete, but it has nothing to do with that. It's do you get back up and keep going?
Yeah.
That's what defines a athlete of really high intensity versus just someone else. Someone else
Mm-hmm.
stops, they just get up and keep going. So like if in your daily life, if you wake up depressed, then you get up and you keep going and you eventually find a way to get out of it. If you wake up and you find a way to make your environment a better one, if you find a way to make your life better, those are the things that define resilience. And I love that that's your story. I think that's wonderful and beautiful. So then
Yeah.
what's next for Hillary and her resilience?
Oh boy. Well,
I mean,
like
you have
I
your
said,
neuroscience degree,
yeah.
you're an athlete,
Mm-hmm. I'm a coach.
you're a coach. How do you bring it all together?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, I think it's a constant balancing act. It's like I try to think about it as prioritizing different things, different types of times of year. So obviously I'm still racing. And now I've, added cycling to the mix. So I'm like trying to prioritize my year based on which cycling races I'm doing versus which running races and how I want to target that. Um, and then, obviously the constant throughout it all is, coaching the athletes that I coach, which is a really fulfilling and like really cool way to kind of give back and keep learning about the sport and also keep learning, just how to be a better person, but also athlete myself, but also, just how to share the knowledge. I think it's really cool. And then writing is still a really important part. I still am, writing kind of different excerpts in like my little blog, but I'm actually I want to write another book, and the topic that I'm kind of exploring is a topic of resilience. So maybe I'll be sending you some emails for some article things, because I want to
Yeah,
combine a little bit of storytelling with the science-based. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of prioritizing, what what is most important at certain times of year. So I'm not, operating on, 100% of running all the time or 100% coaching. It's like, okay, like which one's taking 1, 2, and 3, however many things you want to list. Prioritizing, I'm here at home, like not traveling. So prioritizing time with friends and family and all that good stuff. Like, I think really it's important for me to balance all the things that make me feel like a whole human outside of just being an athlete. We talked, I'm such a huge scientist, so trying to to incorporate all of those things that make me whole, and not just focusing so much on the running and competing side of things.
yeah.
But that can be, it's such a moving target, because I've experienced, many injuries over the past 6.5 years from this fall. And so every year is not predictable. Like, I was just going through another injury last year, and it allowed me the space to lean into a different aspect of cycling, which was mountain biking, and I really loved it. And so,
It's so fun.
it is. I don't want to get injured with it, but doing cross country races, or I think the biggest thing for me, and like where I'm seeing myself in the future, I have my goals this year about, UTMB. It's a 100-mile race in the Alps, and I'm targeting a 100-mile race there this summer. But really letting myself have a little bit of room for freedom, like a little bit of room for the unexpected. Um, and that can be in sport, but that's also around a lot of travel. Like, I love that experience of like immersing myself in a culture wherever I go. It's not just about the race for me, it's about everything else that the race brings together. And like that last year I went on a 1,500-mile bike packing race in Ireland, and it was so incredibly hard.
The
But it was
photos were amazing on that one.
Yeah, but it was like so much fun. And so I've crafted my own long distance bike packing trip, 1,500 miles up the coast of Scotland, visiting some places that my dad grew up. And it's combining the adventure piece with, it's, maybe not how everyone is going to train and prepare themselves for a 100-mile race, but it feeds my soul so much that I don't care. I'm just going to go for
Guinness
it.
is filled with protein.
Yeah, that's true. But what about Scotch? Because I'll be in Scotland this year, so I don't know
Scotch is
about
really good
that.
for recovery, right? It'll thin your blood. It'll help it move
Great.
through your system more
Put me
quickly.
right to sleep.
Just replace your Normatec boots with your Scotch
Great.
for
Okay, cool.
the
So yeah,
doctor's
stuff
orders.
like
There you
that.
go.
Yeah, and just really, having a plan, but then also I think the biggest thing is having a plan, and I do really enjoy that, but also being okay if it changes,
Yeah,
and shifting with that. I think that's one of the biggest concepts of, being resilient and being able to kind of change things when, listen to your body when it's telling you to slow down, or, maybe I'm not going to be ready for this race, or yeah, like letting things shift around as they need to, and then letting kind of life and new experiences come to you as they will. And kind of going all in with it. So
yeah.
yeah.
For the resilience, we'll have to hook up another time because there's this really interesting concept behind allostatic load where you're essentially, if you imagine your life as a jar,
Mm,
right, and it's filled with your life. If I were to ask most humans, and I'll ask you, if you imagine your life as a jar,
mm.
100% is you're overwhelmed. How much on a daily basis, every given day, how full percentage wise is your jar?
Over
It's
like
taken us
overwhelmed.
it's taken us
That's like
three
in a
weeks to get
negative.
this podcast. We've tried this podcast 3 times. This is our third time. We've had to reschedule. So how full is your jar on a daily basis?
95.
95. Okay. So most people, if they sit at 100%, 99 is a pretty common response.
Yeah.
They think the solution is emptying out the jar. This is a concept from neurodiversity. I happen to be neurodivergent. I've got pretty severe ADHD.
Mm,
And so this is a concept that comes from neurodiversity, which is living with your neurosis and allowing it to be amplified as opposed to trying to control it
Mm.
environmentally.
Mhm.
And so you allow, like I allow my ADHD to go out of control, quote
Mm.
unquote, out of control. And it tends to be where I'm able to do a lot of different things at the same time in a more efficient manner than trying to do one thing by controlling it. And so
Right. Yeah.
instead of emptying out the jar, which is what most people try to do, get a massage, take a bath, go for a walk in the woods, sleep, read a book, something calming, right? Empty out the jar. My theory is no, live at your 99% and grow your jar. Keep
Mm.
your jar at 99% until that becomes so normative for you that it's easy. And what
Yeah.
happens is you just get a bigger jar. But now that you have a bigger jar, don't put more stress in there.
Yeah.
Just keep the bigger
Exactly.
jar with the same level of stress because now it doesn't fill it up to 99%.
Yeah.
And there's a big theory around that with resilience in that you're building up your ability to withstand
Yeah.
stressors as long as you don't become at an overwhelmed state. And as long
Right.
as you stay at the limit of it, your resilience increases. And now there is a breaking point.
Hmm.
Too much of that without recovery, without pause, and the
Hmm.
system collapses on itself. Yeah.
Hmm. I know I like to think about that as like different days, like it's all really full, but then, it's like having a day. I'm also someone who I really know myself and I know when I'm definitely an introvert and I say 95% because I need that extra 5% for just me. Like I don't want anything to
Now,
be
when you say 95%, are you in pain currently?
no.
So add pain to the count. So think
Right.
of most humans who they describe their life as 99%. And I say, okay, well, now you have low back pain. You're instantly overwhelmed,
Yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
already it consumes so much of the jar on its own, acute or chronic pain. And you've had
Yeah.
those moments where you've lived with them. So it's an interesting concept around resilience. So we'll have to talk about that in the future when
Yeah.
you're a little more. Well, awesome, Hillary. I'm so grateful for this the podcast. I'm really thankful you came along. This is
Yeah.
an opportunity for you also to do any advertising in your podcast or your book if you're interested, letting my listeners know who you are and where they can get some of your information.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks so much for having me on, and I can't wait to listen to more of the ones that you have coming out soon. But basically, everything that you need to know to follow me would be on my Instagram, hillygoat_climbs, and my website, so hillaryallen.com. So I have my book, I'm a coach, so some other kind of resources on there, my blog. So yeah, my website is probably the best place, hillaryallen.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Hillary. I can't wait to see where the future takes you. And maybe one day we'll get you down to our convention to do the presentation that we talked about in the past.
Yeah, that'd be so
Yeah.
great. Thanks so much for having me.
We'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.